do this one. This is called Poetry.
Yes! Yeah!
Very fitting, yeah? Well, I'm a poet after all. Anyway, here we go. Poetry. Poetry, poetry, poetry. Poetry, existential drivel dripping from the mouth. Poetry, political pus oozing from the pores of renegades and social lepers. Poetry, last refuge of a lost man. Poetry, beauty wrapped up in tin foil. Poetry, milk flowing down from the tits of history. Poetry, collective consciousness of the expanding universe. Poetry, sex and bombs mixed in your coffee. Poetry, moon and shadow lamenting existence. Poetry, naked women working jackhammers digging out the underground. Poetry, dead cows hanging from your windows. Poetry, do you have the right to kill? Poetry, sunlight pouring down dirty chimneys. Poetry, varicose veins on your grandmother's legs. Poetry, the fool's mechanism to strive for wisdom. Poetry, my piss pot has been stolen. Poetry, are you meaning? Poetry, are you sound? Poetry, are you feeling? Poetry, are you music? Poetry, come forward, identify yourself. Poetry, the ring of pleasure on a fattening youth. Poetry, the worship of monkeys in gold suits. Poetry, the makeshift cave of a lost tribe. Poetry, the vomit patrons of a footpath drunk. Poetry, the ice caps are melting. Poetry, Persia is burning. Poetry, I don't care. Poetry, please pay my fucking rent. Poetry, 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 banging on my door at 6 in the morning. Poetry, gold in the mines of Brazil. Poetry, the inclusion of exclusion. Poetry in the young girl's neck. Poetry in movements, poetry in breathing, poetry in dreaming, poetry in believing. Poetry, the last sounds of the summer's evening. Poetry, 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 banging on my door at 6 in the morning. Poetry, I have to get up. Poetry in the ceiling, poetry in the floor, poetry in the bed and the roots of my Irish head. Poetry, goodbye, I'm gonna run away. Poetry, I love you, let us stay. Poetry in my pen, poetry in the air. Poetry we must dare, we must penetrate this limpid air. Poetry, the staff in your hand, the crow upon your shoulder. Poetry, the journey you must take. That's it for me.